People look at older men who are single and whisper to themselves, they must be lonely. They must be broken. They must be waiting for someone to save them. But what if I told you the truth is nothing like what you think? I have sat across from men in their 50s, 60s, even 70s. I have heard their stories. They are not sitting around feeling sorry for themselves. They are not counting the days until someone comes along to rescue them. So take a seat with me for a few minutes. Pour yourself a cup of coffee. Because I want to take you into their world. And if you are one of those men, I want you to know that what you are feeling is not weakness. It is strength. I want to start with what they have been through because you cannot understand why they are choosing to be single until you know what they have survived. Some of them have walked through divorce. The kind where the house feels too quiet after the kids leave. Where you hear your own footsteps echo down the hallway. Where the first night you sleep alone, you stare at the ceiling, wondering if you will ever feel normal again. Others have faced betrayal. They trusted someone with everything and watched it all fall apart. They have sat in courtrooms fighting for custody, signing papers that split up decades of work, handing over house keys to someone they no longer recognize. And it is not just divorce. Some have buried their wives. They have stood next to a casket, with their grown children holding their hands and felt a silence so heavy they could barely breathe. They have gone home to a closet still full of her clothes, her coffee mug still on the counter, and tried to figure out how to keep living in a house that suddenly felt too big. Even the ones who were never married have their own stories. Relationships that ended after years of trying. Women who left without warning. Promises that were made and then broken. And let us be honest, life takes a toll. These men have spent decades carrying responsibility, paying mortgages, working long hours, coaching baseball games, fixing broken fences, sitting at kitchen tables, figuring out how to make ends meet. So when the last kid moves out, when the divorce papers are signed, when the noise finally stops, something surprising happens. They exhale. For the first time in years, they are not waking up to an alarm clock for someone else's schedule. They are not sleeping on the edge of a bed to leave room for someone who is no longer there. They are not negotiating every choice, every weekend, every vacation. This is the part most people do not see. Before the peace comes the storm. Before the freedom comes the heartbreak. These men have cried in parking lots, yelled in empty rooms, driven around at night just to avoid going home. They have been through the fire and come out the other side with scars you cannot see. So when you see a man sitting alone at a diner with a book in his hand, do not assume he is lonely. He might be sitting in the first real quiet he has had in years. He might be tasting freedom for the very first time, and that is where our story begins. Once the storm had passed, something almost magical began to happen. Life started to feel wide open again. I have seen these men rediscover their mornings. Not the rushed mornings where they are racing out the door, but slow, quiet mornings. The kind where you wake up with the sun slipping through the curtains, with no alarm clock blaring. The kind where you make coffee exactly the way you like it. Sit down at the kitchen table, and let the first sip remind you that you are still here. There is a quiet joy in that moment. They start picking up old hobbies again. They dust off the fishing poles and roll the motorcycle out of the garage. Sign up for that art class they never had time for. Some take long walks in the park. Others travel to places they have dreamed of for years. And some simply sit on the porch and watch the world go by. It is not about running away from people. It is about running toward themselves. One man I spoke to bought a used camper and just started driving. No one telling him where to go. No one complaining about the radio station. No arguments about where to stop for dinner. He told me that for the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly living on his own terms. Another man began cooking for himself. Real meals instead of frozen dinners. He learned to grill steak just the way he likes it. He even learned to bake fresh bread. And soon he was inviting friends over for Sunday meals. These might sound like small things. But when you have spent decades putting everyone else first, small freedoms can feel enormous. And there is another piece no one talks about. Peace. Peace of mind is not something you can buy. It is something you earn. And these men have earned it. They no longer have to argue about how to load the dishwasher. They do not have to defend every decision. They do not have to walk on eggshells, wondering what kind of mood someone will be in when they get home. For the first time, they can sit in their own living rooms, turn on the music they love, turn it off when they want to, and simply breathe. Some people look at that and call it loneliness. But I think it is something else entirely. I think it is healing. Healing looks like a man sitting in his backyard watching the sunset and smiling to himself. Healing looks like buying that classic car he has always wanted and spending weekends under the hood. Healing looks like falling asleep with the TV still on and no one telling him to turn it down. And do not mistake this for bitterness. Most of these men are not angry. They are not swearing off love forever. They are simply learning to enjoy their own company. That is an underrated skill. To be able to sit with yourself and feel at peace. And here is the beautiful part. When they do choose to date again, they do it from a place of strength, not desperation. They are not looking for someone to fix them, because they have already done the work. They are looking for someone who adds to their life, not someone to fill a hole. That is what freedom really looks like. Not just the absence of someone else, but the presence of yourself. Something else has been happening quietly over the years. Society has started to change. There was a time when being single after 40 or 50 carried a certain weight. People would tilt their heads and ask when you were going to settle down again, as if your life were on pause until you had a partner. But these days, the questions are softer. Sometimes they do not come at all. Friends are starting to respect the choice. Family is learning that you can be content without being coupled. I have seen men host backyard barbecues with neighbors and friends where nobody asks why they are alone. They just pass the ribs and share a laugh. I have seen them take group trips to the mountains or to the coast without anyone assuming it means they are searching for a new spouse. This shift matters because it gives these men space to breathe. Space to decide what they really want instead of what everyone else expects. And here is where the story takes its turn. This is not about fear. It is not about bitterness. This is about freedom. Freedom to wake up and decide what kind of day you want to have. Freedom to spend money on a hobby without asking permission. Freedom to sit in silence or crank up the music and dance in your kitchen without worrying about what anyone thinks. For a long time, we were told that happiness looked like a house with a white fence, 2 cars in the driveway, and a couple holding hands on the porch. And that can be beautiful. But it is not the only picture that matters. For some men, happiness looks like walking into a quiet house at the end of the day and knowing it is their space. It looks like finishing a book at midnight just because they can. It looks like not having to apologize for wanting peace. One man told me he used to dread Sunday nights because it meant arguments about schedules and chores. Now he lights a fire in the fireplace. It makes himself a drink and enjoys the quiet as if it were a reward. Another said he never knew how much he loved gardening until he had a whole Saturday to himself. He grows tomatoes, peppers, and even a little patch of sunflowers just because they make him smile. And here is the truth. Choosing to be single is not giving up. It is not a sign that you have failed at love. It is a sign that you are learning to love yourself enough not to settle for less than what you deserve. This is the climax of the story. Because this is the moment we stop seeing these men as victims and start seeing them as men who know exactly what they want. And maybe that is the lesson we can all take. That happiness does not have to look the same for everyone. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is live a life that makes sense to you, even if it surprises everyone else. When I look back over all these stories, one thing becomes clear. Every man I have talked to who chose to stay single after 50 has been writing his own book. Each chapter may have started with loss, with heartbreak, with confusion, but every chapter has led to a kind of wisdom that cannot be rushed. These men have learned something that many of us take a lifetime to figure out. They have learned that happiness is not something you find in another person. It is something you build quietly, day after day, decision after decision, inside your own life. I think about a man named Paul who told me that after his divorce he spent 6 months eating dinner, standing over the sink. He said he could not bear to set the table for one. But little by little, he started to reclaim that space. One night he lit a candle just for himself. Another night he cooked a meal from scratch and actually sat down to eat it. He said that was the night he realized he was going to be okay. I think about another man named Carlos who lost his wife after 40 years of marriage. For months he could not sleep in their bed. He would doze off on the couch with the TV on, just so the house did not feel so quiet. Then one morning he woke up to the sound of birds outside the window. He got up. I made coffee and sat in her favorite chair. He told me that was the day he stopped surviving and started living again. And that is what this whole conversation is about. It is about men who have stopped just surviving and have started living. You might think living alone would feel empty, But what I see is the opposite. Their lives are full of small rituals that give them peace, full of friendships that go deeper because they are chosen, not forced, full of hobbies that bring them joy just for the sake of joy. One man built a wood shop in his garage and now spends weekends making furniture for his kids and grandkids. Another joined a hiking group and has walked trails in 6 different states in the past year. Yet another started volunteering at a local shelter because he finally had the time and energy to give back. These are not men who have given up. These are men who are building something new. And here is the thing I wish everyone would understand. Choosing to be single at this stage of life is not the end of the story. It is simply a different kind of story. A story with its own kind of romance. Yes, there can still be love. Some of them will fall in love again. Some will remarry. Some will not. But love no longer feels like something they have to chase. It is something they will welcome if it arrives and feel at peace if it does not. There is a quiet power in that. Because when you no longer need someone to make you whole, you can finally choose someone just because you enjoy them. Because they make the good days even better. Because they sit with you on the porch in the evening and do not need to fill the silence with anything but their presence. And if love does not come, these men are still living lives worth telling. Think about the freedom of waking up on a Saturday and deciding exactly what to do with your time. Think about reading until 2 in the morning because no one is waiting on you to turn out the light. Think about planting a tree in your backyard and knowing you will be the one to sit under its shade. There is dignity in that kind of independence. And it is important to say this. These men are not against relationships. They are simply unwilling to trade their peace for chaos. They are unwilling to shrink themselves just to fit into a relationship that does not honor who they have become. That takes courage. It takes courage to tell your family no when they pressure you to date again. It takes courage to go to a wedding alone. It takes courage to sit at Thanksgiving dinner and smile politely when someone says you should not be alone at your age. But every time they make that choice, they are teaching the rest of us something important. That your worth is not tied to whether someone else chooses you. That your life can be rich and full and meaningful even if you are the only one sitting at the table. I hope if you are watching this and you are one of those men, you can hear this clearly. You are not broken. You are not less than. You are not missing out on life. You are living it. You are writing chapters that no one else could write. You are proving that happiness does not have a single shape. And you are giving the rest of us permission to ask ourselves what we really want instead of just doing what we are told. So, if you have ever felt ashamed of being single at this age, I want you to set that shame down. You do not need it anymore. Instead, pick up curiosity, pick up gratitude, pick up joy. Make a list of all the things you have always wanted to do and start doing them. Learn to play the guitar. Take a trip by train. Invite friends over for a movie night. Fill your home with music or with silence. Whatever makes you feel alive. And if one day love shows up at your door, you will not be meeting it from a place of need, but from a place of wholeness. And that is the best way to love and be loved. So let this be your reminder. You are allowed to live a life that looks different from what anyone expected. You are allowed to enjoy your own company. You are allowed to choose peace. Thank you for sitting with me today. If this message spoke to you, to share it with someone who might need to hear it, and keep writing your story. One quiet morning. One bold choice. One peaceful evening at a time. Because this life is yours, and that is worth celebrating.